I recently spent some time in the Ruhr Valley, once the thumping industrial heart of Europe. I met a man named Klaus, a third-generation steelworker who used to walk into the plant with a sense of ironclad job security. He showed me a photo on his phone from a few years back, the sky lit up orange by the blast furnaces, a symbol of German might. He spoke about the green leap transition back then with a cautious sort of pride, genuinely believing the promises that Germany will become the world's first climate-neutral industrial superpower. He even supported the nuclear phase-out. To him, it felt like the moral path forward. But then the conversation shifted. He pulled up his most recent electricity bill for 2025. His expression went from nostalgic to hollowed out in an instant. The figures on the screen had more than doubled, a stark digital testament to a dream turned into a nightmare. "We traded our blast furnaces for windmills," he said, staring at the silent skyline, "and now we can't even afford to heat our homes." It wasn't just his personal struggle that was chilling, but the surrounding silence. The massive industrial complexes that once defined the German economic miracle are now becoming hushed monuments to a self-inflicted decline. What's truly surreal is the disconnect. While the data shows German steel production plummeting to survival-level lows and automotive profits cratering by nearly 60%, the bureaucracy in Brussels remains almost celebratory, doubling down on net zero targets as if the industrial heart of the continent isn't currently on life support. It's a bizarre, clinical kind of suicide, a nation voluntarily dismantling its own engine while the pilots insist everything is going according to plan. As I watched the for lease signs multiply across the valley, I realized this isn't just an economic slump. It's an autopsy of a superpower that chose to stop breathing.
That story, the one about Klaus, it's more than just chilling. It perfectly encapsulates the profound strategic vulnerability that Europe has really created for itself. And what we're looking at today is, it's an autopsy. An autopsy of what was, arguably the world's most successful manufacturing economy.
Right. And we have to move beyond that personal story, as powerful as it is, and really dig into the hard numbers. So for our deep dive today, that's the mission, to take that anecdote and ground it in concrete data, a clinical autopsy.
Exactly. We need to examine the harsh, granular economic figures and the strategic policy choices that led to this decline.
So we're going to analyze precisely how these radical decarbonization policies are eroding manufacturing competitiveness. We'll look at the systemic risks this poses, not just for Europe, but globally. And I think this is the key part. We'll assess the geopolitical winners and losers of this self-inflicted energy crisis.
And that collapse, it is structurally rooted in an energy disparity that is, well, it's truly unprecedented in recent economic history. It is the fundamental problem. If you don't solve that, almost no other policy intervention even matters.
Okay, so let's start right there. The first piece of hard data we have to face is the price shock itself. This is the direct result of, voluntarily dismantling a reliable, cheap source of pipeline gas.
The very foundation of their industrial base.
The foundation. And trading it for a total reliance on the much more volatile global market for liquefied natural gas.
And when we actually quantify this increase, the figures are, they're absolutely damning for European industry. If we look ahead at the gas price forecast for 2024, European prices, they're measured by the TTF, which is the key Dutch benchmark.
Right, the one everyone uses for trading.
Exactly. They are projected to be around $14 per Ubuntu.
$14. That's a stunning figure. And you have to remember, gas isn't just fuel to heat homes. For industry, it's the primary feedstock for what? Chemicals, plastics, fertilizers?
Everything. It's the lifeblood.
So what's the critical context here? What are American rivals paying for the exact same commodity?
That's the core of the problem. The U.S. benchmark, Henry Hub, is only expected to be about $3.25 per min2 in that same period.
Wow. Okay, so do the math on that.
It's a chronic 3 to 5 times price premium. Every single European factory owner wakes up knowing they're operating with this massive disadvantage on their most fundamental input compared to their American and really their Asian rivals too.
And this isn't a temporary blip, is it?
No. Projections currently suggest this extreme disparity is going to last for several more years. It's fundamentally locking in a competitive disadvantage.
That disparity. It doesn't just explain the silence in the Ruhr Valley, it explains why entire industries are just vanishing. If energy is your single biggest cost for steel, for aluminum, glass, cement, and crucially, fertilizer.
Nitrogen fertilizer especially.
Right. Operating at 300% to 500%, the cost of your main competitor is, well, it's a guaranteed path to closure or capital flight. Or just picking up and moving somewhere else?
Let's stick with fertilizer for a second because it's one of the most immediate and profound casualties. The high cost of natural gas directly hits the Haber-Bosch process.
Which is how we make ammonia, the building block of all nitrogen fertilizers.
Exactly. When gas is $14, that process just becomes uneconomical overnight. European chemical giants have either had to dramatically cut back production or, in some cases, shut down plants entirely.
And if Europe can't produce its own nitrogen fertilizer affordably, what does that mean for the rest of the world? What's the global implication?
The implication is food price instability. Fertilizer is absolutely fundamental to global crop yields. So the German industrial collapse translates directly into higher costs for agriculture across Europe and, globally. It contributes directly to the inflationary pressures that hurt the very people Klaus represents, the domestic working class.
This is where a local industrial failure becomes a global systemic risk.
Precisely.
So, just to be clear on the cause, this staggering price cap wasn't just the green transition policies. It was the geopolitical shock of the Ukraine crisis layered on top of a gas market that was already in trouble post-2021.
That's right. The pipeline links between Russia and Europe broke down, prices shot up, and then they just stabilized at this chronically high level. The price stability that had underpinned the entire German economic model for decades was gone. Forever.
The dependence just shifted, but the affordability and the security were sacrificed.
And the result is pure quantitative demand destruction across the whole continent. We can measure it in the gas consumption figures, which are just shocking.
We'll get to those. But what still seems baffling, as I mentioned at the start, is this apparent bureaucratic disconnect, this regulatory weight. While industry is hemorrhaging, Brussels seems to be doubling down on the Green Pact.
It is the paradox of an ideological mandate completely overriding immediate economic reality. The European Commission is operating under the belief that the most effective response to this energy crisis is actually to accelerate the energy transition.
So the answer to a crisis caused by an energy shortage is to accelerate the shortage.
That's how it appears. They're determined to enforce the Green Pact through faster construction of solar and wind, believing that this short-term pain is just necessary for the long-term goals of decarbonization and demethanization. They see the crisis not as a reason to pause, but as a reason to floor it.
But doesn't that strategy just make the energy supply more intermittent? It doesn't solve the base load problem that gas used to cover. You need power when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing.
It does. It requires massive, immediate, and debt-fueled investment in storage and grid infrastructure. All while the foundational industrial consumers, the steel mills and chemical plants, are being forced offline by the existing high prices. It's a huge strain on public finances, and you're eroding your tax base at the exact same time.
And they aren't just stopping at their own borders. They're trying to export this mandate globally with one of the most complex regulatory tools we've seen in international trade.
And that brings us to the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. This is a crucial topic for any global manufacturer. It entered its transitional test phase on October 1st, 2023, and it's scheduled to be fully operational and enforced in January 2026.
Okay, so this mechanism is designed to prevent what they call carbon leakage. But let's break down what CBAM actually does and why it's causing so much friction globally. It's more than just a simple climate tax.
At its core, yes, CBAM tries to equalize the price of carbon. If an EU steel producer pays a certain amount under the EU's emissions trading system, the ETS, then imported steel has to pay an equivalent carbon price at the border. The goal is to stop carbon-intensive industry from just relocating outside the EU to places with looser rules, only to export the finished product right back to Europe.
Which sounds reasonable in theory, but the practical implementation, that's where the problems start. It essentially forces foreign companies to play by EU rules or face a huge import tax.
That is the consequence. And the complexity, the compliance burden, it's staggering, particularly for developing nations. An exporter needs to calculate the precise embedded emissions in their product.
From the very start of the supply chain.
From raw material extraction all the way to final production. This requires sophisticated, verifiable data gathering across incredibly complex supply chains. Many smaller or developing economies simply don't have the infrastructure or the expertise to do that efficiently.
So CBAM isn't just a tariff. It's an expensive, bureaucratic imposition of EU regulatory standards on the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Who are the primary targets and Are there any unexpected casualties?
Well, it certainly impacts major rivals like Russia and China. They export massive amounts of cement, iron, steel, and aluminum to the EU. But the unexpected casualties are often closer allies and developing nations that rely heavily on trade with Europe.
Like who?
We're talking about countries like the UK, Norway, Albania, Moldova, even places like Zimbabwe, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and North Macedonia. These are nations that might not have the immediate capital to shift their production to low-carbon methods or to implement the necessary monitoring infrastructure.
So the EU, which is already struggling with its own cost crisis, is now essentially exporting that cost pressure and regulatory headache onto its trading partners. It's a mechanism that forces everyone to adhere to the EU's timeline, no matter what their own economic situation is.
And that contributes significantly to global trade fragmentation, which in turn feeds directly back into the economic fallout we're seeing in the EU's own industrial engine, Germany. The policy choices, dismantling the gas supply, imposing radical regulation, they are now showing up very clearly in the GDP figures.
Okay, let's get to that data. Germany, the historical anchor of the EU economy, is visibly struggling. What does the expected 2024 forecast tell us about just how severe this deindustrialization is?
The continued inflationary pressures, combined with these perpetually high interest rates, cause a significant slowdown across the entire EU in 2023. But if we focus just on Germany, the expected GDP growth forecast for 2024 is critically low, just 0.8%.
Less than 1% growth.
Yeah.
For the world's fourth largest economy, that's stagnation. If you adjust for underlying inflation and the need to service their public debt, that figure represents a significant real-term contraction in prosperity.
It's a level of anemic growth that signals real structural damage. Germany, along with countries like the Czech Republic and Sweden, has entered a negative zone in terms of GDP dynamics. This is not just a cyclical slowdown, it's a clear quantitative sign of deindustrialization. High-value, high-employment industrial capacity isn't just paused, it's being permanently lost.
And we can track that loss directly in the energy demand figures, which ties us right back to Klaus and the silent factories. It's not that Germany just switched its energy source, it's that the consumers of that energy, they simply vanished.
Absolutely. The decline in gas demand across Europe has now stabilized at nearly 100 billion cubic meters. That's BCM below the 2021 level.
100 BC meters. That's a powerful, shocking number. Can you put that into context for us?
To give you a sense of scale, 100 BC meters is roughly the annual consumption of several medium-sized industrial nations combined. This is not a slight shift to renewables. This is pure structural demand destruction.
100 BC meters of demand destruction. That's the measurable footprint of the factories, the chemical plants, the jobs that have just evaporated because of these chronic high energy costs. That is the macro scale validation of Klaus's personal story. The economic structure just couldn't bear the price premium.
And that 100 BC meter deficit forces us to accept a hard truth. The high-cost structure imposed on Europe's industrial engine has resulted in shrinkage, not a green revolution. The energy linkage broke down, prices stabilized at a crippling level, and the physical industry had no choice but to retreat.
Okay, so let's dig into that retreat. The story of the steelworker in the Ruhr Valley was deeply personal, but the data is confirming his worst fears. This energy crisis is a full-scale systemic collapse, impacting the very core of European manufacturing. Let's start with the backbone: steel.
Steel is the textbook example. It's an energy-intensive sector that simply cannot survive a chronic 3 to 5 times cost premium. And you have to remember, globally, the steel market is already fiercely competitive. There's a production capacity surplus right now of a staggering 600 million tons.
So margins are already razor thin.
Exactly. Efficiency is the only way to survive. Yet Western governments, both in the US and the EU, have chosen to focus their stimulus programs heavily on the climate agenda. Mandatory shifts toward hydrogen, subsidies for battery production, mandates for electric vehicles.
This is where that policy disconnect really hurts, isn't it? You're creating demand for some very specific types of steel specialized metals for wind turbines or EV bodies, but you're simultaneously driving the production cost of all steel through the roof.
Precisely. It creates a deeply schizophrenic market. It drives demand for these niche, highly regulated metals needed for the green transition. But at the same time, the high energy costs raise production costs across the board for the traditional real sector of the economy.
Bulk producers.
The bulk producers of rebar, concrete, basic chemicals, the industrial intermediates that form the foundation. That foundation is being systematically eroded to support a very specific, niche, and government-subsidized transition.
So the traditional industrial base, the part that employs millions, is forced to compete globally against massive overcapacity and deal with crippling energy prices, while the government is only pushing capital into these specific green sectors. It feels like an economic squeeze designed to force a painful exit.
And this structural pain translates directly into lost production. For instance, everyone talks about the transition to green steel using hydrogen or direct reduced iron, DRI. They hail it as the future. But it requires massive, multi-billion-dollar upfront capital investments. No company can justify that kind of investment when its current operating margins are being destroyed by unaffordable gas. They're caught. They're stuck between impossible operating costs today and insurmountable capital requirements for tomorrow.
And we see these constraints filtering through the entire supply chain, right? Even when we look at industries just next door to Germany, we see this systemic vulnerability.
Yes, the problem isn't isolated. It's interesting, even if you look at statistics for Russia's industrial base, which is under the intense constraint of Western sanctions, you see declines in their auto industry down over 20% and general machine building down almost 9%. This just illustrates the shared vulnerability across Europe's extended supply chains when faced with cost spikes and suppressed global demand.
Let's turn to another key energy-intensive material, aluminum. It's vital for everything from construction to aviation to EVs. What does its current state tell us about European industrial health?
Aluminum production is very revealing. Global growth at the moment is being driven almost solely by China, which has massive state-backed energy resources. Meanwhile, Europe, despite being a huge consumer, they used 9.5 million tons in 2022, is profoundly exposed. The entire global aluminum industry is facing a sharp tightening of decarbonization requirements for primary metal production.
Which is often linked back to that CBAM mechanism we just discussed.
Exactly. So if Europe can't afford the immense energy needed to produce its own primary aluminum, and regulations are also forcing stricter carbon rules on imported aluminum, what's the ultimate cost to the European economy?
You become deeply reliant on imports.
Deeply reliant, which immediately increases your exposure to geopolitical supply risks and price volatility. And this combination of unaffordable power and tightening environmental standards, it's like a permanent stress test for all aluminum producers. The reality is that European capacity is shrinking. Several major European aluminum, zinc, and ammonia plants have already halted or drastically scaled back production because it's literally cheaper to buy the metal from abroad, even after you factor in shipping.
So this industrial retreat, this high-cost structure for all heavy industry, it's happening against a very severe backdrop of global financial constraints. It's not like governments can just wave a magic wand and subsidize their way out of this permanent energy imbalance.
And that brings us to the long-term debt constraint. This is the systemic financial pressure that's underlying the entire global economy. We need to broaden the view here to the global structural limits. The simple reality is that neither developed countries, including the EU, nor China, have a sustainable way to support robust economic growth except by continually increasing their debt burden, which is already at historically high levels everywhere.
This is the critical connection then. The systemic risks from this long-standing development on loan model are now colliding with the catastrophic cost of an enforced energy transition.
Exactly. The model means that the push for this radical transition, a push that requires enormous multi-trillion-dollar upfront capital investments in new infrastructure, new tech, R&D, it's happening at a time when the ability of governments to spend their way out of problems is severely constrained. Every dollar spent on green subsidies, every euro of debt taken on to smooth the transition just adds to an already overstretched public balance sheet.
Wait a minute. If Europe is simultaneously killing its tax-paying, revenue-generating traditional industries and taking on massive new debt to build their replacements, how is that possibly sustainable? Isn't that just trading an industrial suicide for a financial one?
That is the essential challenge. It's a double whammy. The costs of the energy transition are hitting the industrial base directly through utility bills, killing current profitability, and they are hitting governments through massive debt accrual, making the pre-existing systemic risk even worse.
Expensive energy is killing existing industry, and expensive debt is limiting the government's ability to finance the replacement.
And this situation isn't just in Europe. You mentioned China is also grappling with this. China is facing intense domestic problems of its own. A major real estate market crisis, declining foreign direct investment, the threat of increased trade restrictions. Their economic model is malfunctioning, and they too are supporting growth primarily by accumulating massive debt, especially at the local government level. The global push for climate action, while essential, fundamentally intensifies these financial risks across the entire world because the transition is being funded on borrowed money.
This is clearly a structural inflection point. Pure ideology, the net zero mandate, is meeting the hard limits of economic, energy, and financial reality. The result is industrial retreat. So the next logical question is, where is all that lost power and wealth flowing?
Well, what we're seeing in Europe is the direct consequence of voluntarily dismantling reliable sovereign supply chains. It leads to a profound erosion of energy security. And that, in turn, has immediately resulted in strategic gains for rivals who pursued more pragmatic paths.
And the most immediate, most profitable strategic shift for some of those actors was in natural gas, triggered by the collapse of European pipeline gas.
Yes, the disruption of the European pipeline market, that intentional severing of the Russia-Europe supply link. It provided a powerful and sustained impetus for the global liquefied natural gas, or LNG, market. Suddenly, Europe needed massive, constant volumes of gas transported by sea, not by pipeline, and that fundamentally and permanently reoriented global energy flows.
And who became the massive structural beneficiaries of this desperate European demand surge?
The US and Qatar. They have significantly strengthened their positions as the new dominant major LNG exporters. The data reflects this shift immediately. In the first half of 2023, the U.S. regained its position as the world's largest LNG exporter.
And where is most of that LNG going?
The main flows are directed squarely to Europe and the UK, replacing that lost Russian supply.
So the U.S. isn't just an ally in this. It has become the strategic energy replacement for Russia for the entire European continent. That is a massive, multi-decade geopolitical shift in dependence.
It is. And the shift is structural and long-term. U.S. LNG export capacity is expected to increase by an additional 100 billion cubic meters, 100 BC meters, by 2027. This influx fundamentally changes European energy security. Europe has traded dependence on a proximate, often hostile neighbor, Russia, for dependence on a new, distant, politically motivated supplier, the U.S. and Qatar.
So the supply is more diverse, maybe, but the cost is exponentially higher, and you introduce a whole new set of strategic risks like maritime choke points or the risk of a U.S. policy shift down the road.
Energy sovereignty has been fundamentally compromised by prioritizing these ideological mandates.
And while Europe pursued this ideological hyper-regulatory path, the U.S. executed a successful, pragmatic, geopolitical and industrial maneuver. This really highlights the stark contrast in national approaches to the energy transition.
The contrast between the EU's radical, mandate-driven path and the strategies of the world's two largest economies, China and the United States, is critical for understanding this global power shift. Let's start with China.
What's China's core philosophy on the climate agenda?
For China, the climate agenda has traditionally been, and it remains, subordinated to the task of ensuring high rates of economic growth. Their political and economic imperative is social stability, which they linked directly to maintaining momentum and self-sufficiency and self-reliance of their national economy. So while they invest heavily in renewables, the imperative of growth will always override radical green mandates that might threaten employment or production.
That focus on the economy suggests a far more measured and protected industrial transition. They're trying to prevent the kind of self-inflicted industrial wound that Germany sustained by protecting their core manufacturing competitiveness.
Absolutely. Even though China is expected to face a long-term structural slowdown after 2024 because of its own intense domestic issues, the real estate crisis, declining investment, their policy is to prioritize maintaining economic momentum first. They're managing a decline, not accelerating a destruction.
And the United States. We mentioned their growing LNG dominance. How did the U.S. government approach the green transition compared to the hyper-regulatory EU?
The U.S. approach was inherently and overwhelmingly pragmatic. Instead of mandating change through punitive carbon pricing, like the EU's ETS, the federal government basically allowed business to respond independently, intervening primarily through massive incentives and tax breaks. They provided direct government support and tax preferences, especially through things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is estimated to be nearly $2 trillion by 2030.
$2 trillion in incentives. So that's an industrial policy designed to make the transition financially profitable for businesses and consumers, not just mandatory.
Exactly. The U.S. policy fundamentally prioritizes economic and national security alongside the climate agenda. By making the green transition economically advantageous through these vast subsidies, the U.S. avoids that impossible choice of having decarbonization destroy traditional industries. Instead, it incentivizes new, energy-secured domestic production, and it has successfully drawn investments and manufacturing capital that might otherwise have gone to the high-cost, hyper-regulatory EU.
So, to put it bluntly, Europe told industry, go green and pay more, while the U.S. told industry, go green and we will pay you to do it. It's a contest between punitive regulation and massive financial incentive.
And we can clearly see which strategy is winning the global competition for capital right now. This approach ensures the U.S. maintains its economic and financial leadership during this period of global instability, often at the direct expense of its allies in Europe.
Now let's look at the third major consequence of all this turbulence. The sanctions and the energy crisis didn't just create winners in the US and Qatar. They forced a massive reorientation of global trade, creating huge economic opportunities elsewhere, especially in the global south.
This rewiring of global commerce is perhaps the most significant long-term shift. The instability and sanctions forced Russia to completely reorient its exports away from those now closed-off European markets. And the data shows this pivot happening in, rapid real time in 2023.
What were the numbers on that trade reorientation? We need to see the scale of this pivot.
In just the first 9 months of 2023, Russian exports to European countries fell dramatically. They dropped from about 48% of their total to just over 20%.
A massive drop.
Meanwhile, their exports to Asia surged. They rose from about 46% to over 71%. The energy and commodity trade map has been completely redrawn in less than 2 years, and Asia is now the dominant recipient of those flows.
And within Asia, we see countries like India, Turkey, and Singapore taking on this highly beneficial role as strategic mediators in a newly divided world. They are the transactional hubs.
India is the shining primary example of how rigid pragmatism wins in this environment. India played a crucial role in facilitating the recovery of trade by acting as a highly profitable middleman. The best illustration, which really highlights the absurdity of the current system, is crude oil. India significantly increased its imports of Russian oil precisely when Europe cut itself off.
Give us the hard numbers on that increase, because the sheer magnitude is shocking.
Okay. In the fiscal year 2021-22, India imported about $2.2 billion worth of Russian crude oil. In the very next fiscal year, 2022-23, that number exploded to over $31 billion.
A 14-fold increase in 1 year.
More than that. And it continued. In the first half of the next fiscal year, they imported another $36 billion. It's a fundamental economic reversal. So India is securing massive volumes of cheap Russian crude, which Europe no longer buys, processing it in its sophisticated refineries, and then selling the refined products. Where?
Back to Europe.
Back to Europe in the Western market at international market prices. The process is often called a laundromat model, and it is a pure, unadulterated economic win for India.
Let's just break down that profit mechanism. India gets cheap input costs for its refineries. It operates them at high capacity. It sells the refined products, like diesel and jet fuel, at higher international prices to a desperate Europe. And it ultimately boosts its own GDP and economic growth rate significantly, all thanks to the geopolitical turbulence created by the global north.
That is the ultimate conclusion of this segment. Europe's self-imposed energy and sanctions crisis led directly to massive profits and strategic gains for India, who just acts as the transactional middleman. Europe is paying high prices to fund India's economic miracle, based entirely on energy that Europe banned for itself, but with an added layer of cost, risk, and supply chain inefficiency.
Okay, so the story of Klaus, the silent factories, the doubled electricity bills, it's not just a local tragedy. It is a profound structural warning. We need to synthesize the core takeaway here for policymakers globally, especially those considering similar ambitious climate mandates in North America and elsewhere.
The core warning from the German case is that the EU's experience demonstrates the profound economic dangers of prioritizing radical decarbonization targets, net zero mandates, without first securing affordable, stable, and sovereign energy sources. That fundamental strategic error resulted in the catastrophic deindustrialization and energy affordability crisis we're seeing right now.
The fatal flaw seems to be assuming that the timing and the cost of a massive energy transition can be mandated by regulation rather than incentivized by economics or secured through careful industrial planning.
That's the crux of it. The focus on the climate agenda, while it does create some niche subsidized demand for new sectors like EVs and green hydrogen, primarily imposes crushing higher costs on the traditional real sector. And that traditional sector, steel, chemicals, basic manufacturing, agriculture, that is the actual foundation that supports mass employment, tax revenue, and the social stability of the entire economy.
Germany proved that you cannot mandate an energy shortage and still expect to be globally competitive in energy-intensive manufacturing. It's a simple, painful economic equation. If your basic input costs are 400% higher than your rivals, you will not compete. You will simply cease to exist.
It is an immediate test of economic viability. And the German example shows that political dysfunctionality, in their case, the ideologically driven decision to phase out nuclear power before securing stable alternatives, coupled with that heavy reliance on vulnerable pipeline gas, can severely accelerate this decline. It can turn a systemic challenge into an acute, devastating crisis.
Let's pivot to the broader geopolitical conclusion, drawing from the India model, the US LNG dominance, and China's growth-first mandate. The overriding trend emerging from all this instability is a refusal to align based on shared ideology.
This is the prevailing global trend. Transactional geopolitics. We see a consistent, determined refusal by many states, particularly in the global south, to align exclusively with a single bloc. They view the Western insistence on ideological purity, whether it's climate-based or political, as a potential threat to their immediate economic security.
So what's guiding these non-Western countries if it's not shared democratic or environmental values?
Rigid pragmatism and national self-interest. Their priorities are crystal clear and entirely local. They are prioritizing energy security and immediate economic stability over ideological adherence to timelines set in the West. They are not interested in impoverishing their domestic working class, the very people needed for stability and growth, to pursue a target set in Brussels or Washington.
That focus on the domestic working class ties directly back to Klaus, the steel worker, and his doubled electricity bill.
Yeah.
For the rest of the world, avoiding that fate is the primary policy objective.
Absolutely. The ultimate measure of success in this new fragmented environment is no longer adherence to abstract shared values. It's the ability to ensure concrete economic stability and avoid the impoverishment of your own population. That is the metric by which leaders are now being judged in the global south.
And this pragmatic approach is reshaping diplomacy through what's called minilateralism, right? They're forming these flexible alliances that serve an immediate utility rather than some grand ideological strategy.
Yes. Minilateralism, the use of separate alliances and groupings tailored to specific immediate national interests, energy, trade, military supply, is replacing broad, multilateral ideological commitments. Countries are using these flexible alliances to secure what they need, ensuring they maintain maximum autonomy and leverage their position in this divided world. It's a highly rational response to the volatility created by the global north.
So, while the West is busy trying to coordinate massive, complex global frameworks like CBAM, the global South is quietly pursuing practical, profitable, transactional deals like the India crude processing scheme. The transactional approach, driven by national utility, is winning the economic battle.
It's the difference between pursuing an abstract, expensive ideal and securing the immediate physical resources needed to keep the lights on and the factories running. The current global power structures are being reshaped by this economic realism far faster and more effectively than any shared climate ideology can hope to unify them.
So we started this deep dive in the Ruhr Valley, once the proud, thumping engine of the German economic miracle, with the story of Klaus and his astronomical energy bill. And now the autopsy is complete. The core finding is clear. The German industrial heartland has become a structural casualty of an ambitious, yet strategically flawed energy transition.
The combination of the high cost of energy, perpetuated by the breakdown of pipeline supply and accelerated by this radical, unwavering regulation, has systematically shifted manufacturing competitiveness away from Europe. And the beneficiaries are the pragmatic rivals. The US, which used immense subsidies to draw capital, and China, which subordinated its climate agenda to necessary economic growth.
And we can't forget the transactional intermediaries like India, who profited directly and spectacularly from the geopolitical turbulence, highlighting the true cost of this ideological self-restriction. The silence in Klaus's town, that 100 BCM of demand destruction, the chronic 3 to 5 times energy premium, these are not temporary market fluctuations.
No, they're the structural indicators of a great industrial retreat. It's a retreat driven by an ideological mandate that failed to account for economic reality. The lesson is written in the diminishing GDP forecasts and the permanent factory closures across Europe. You cannot achieve net zero targets by making your primary energy sources perpetually unaffordable, especially for your heavy industry. That is simply a formula for deindustrialization, not a successful transition.
Which highlights the ultimate irony and the prevailing geopolitical trend. Despite the West's focus on net zero as a unifying global goal, the rapid shift toward transactional pragmatism among major economic rivals in the rising global South suggests that national self-interest backed by affordable, secure energy is fundamentally reshaping global power structures far faster than any shared climate ideology can manage. That is the reality facing policymakers everywhere right now.